Welcome to this fourth part of our Planned and Prepared Planet. In part 3, we looked at some of the scientific objections by scientists to Darwinism. There are, of course, many more we could refer to. Darwin's confessions of the many problems with his theory are an eye-opener, and to observe the cover-up is astonishing. In this part 4, we will look at why Darwinism does not work, and see that in so many ways there is a far better solution. Darwinism reminds us of a story written by Hans Christian Andersen in 1837, that is, before Darwin's origins. In summary, here it is. There was once an emperor who was very vain. He loved new clothes and parading around showing off. One day some tailors, who were actually swindlers, visited him and persuaded him that they had some very fine clothes which were invisible. When the emperor dressed up in the clothes and paraded through the town, people were shocked but pretended that the emperor was looking magnificent, as they usually had to. But as the emperor came past a little boy who didn't know anything about political correctness, he looked at the emperor and, horrified, shouted out, "Look at the emperor! He hasn't got any clothes on!" And everyone gasped. Knowing what the people now saw, the emperor, greatly embarrassed, rushed back to hide in his palace. The swindlers, however, left town in haste, taking the emperor's money with them. So the vain emperor was robbed and made to look a fool. Now, does this story remind us of Emperor Charles Darwin and his fake news? A quote from ccel.org. It is well to recognize the fact that evolutionists do not constitute a homogeneous party, that while there is a growing disposition to acknowledge the reality of organic evolution, there is likewise a growing tendency to question the sufficiency of the causes by which Mr. Darwin sought to account for it. From the first, there has been an important section of evolutionists, such as Wallace, Lyell, Owen, Mivart, Asa Gray, J.H. Lewes, Danner, and J.J. Murphy, who, with differences among themselves, held that the rise of species could not be accounted for by the Darwinian hypothesis of natural selection, acting on fortuitous variations. The tendency in this school was to seek the causes of evolution within, rather than without, the organism. Most of them were theistic evolutionists. That is, they held that the development of organisms could not be explained without the assumptions of intelligence and purpose. One of the strongest critics of Darwin was the zoologist St. George Jackson Mivart. He was an expert on primates and a former assistant of Huxley's. Mivart had written several articles the previous year that questioned the capacity of the theory of natural selection to explain various animal structures and homologies. Mivart's views were published in an expanded form in Genesis of Species in 1871, which appeared just prior to Descent by Darwin in early 1871. "I dare say it will tell heavily against natural selection," Darwin wrote to Hooker on 21st of January. Natural selection was not first described by Darwin, but by the ancient Greek philosophers, Empedocles and Aristotle, in the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. Many scientists and philosophers in the centuries that followed contributed to the understanding of the adaptation of species due to environmental and competition pressures. They include Harvey, Paley, Linnaeus, Buffon, Malthus, Lamarck, Darwin's grandfather Erasmus Darwin, and Edward Blythe, etc. A quote from Discovery Science. Genetic mutation. Random mutations are claimed to produce life as we now know it. Birds that fly, fish that swim and live in water, animals that can run fast, large ones with great strength, and humans with all their intellectual powers, which are all produced by chance mutations? No, it is actually impossible, according to modern research, by biochemists in laboratories observing evolution. Richard Lenski conducted experiments with E. coli, which multiply very rapidly. Beneficial mutations occurred in the existing genes but broke bracket destructive, not constructive. So there was a change by devolution and not evolution. Trillions of random mutations cannot build anything. Random mutation and natural selection cannot build complex systems, as they tend to degrade them. Good mutations come about by the breaking of existing genes, not by making something new, but by throwing out something that already existed. In the year 2000, the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould announced that there's been no biological change in humans in 40 or 50,000 years, suggesting that evolution in humans is imperceptibly slow or perhaps stopped altogether. We might note, perhaps, it had ceased from the very beginning. The Third Way website was published in 2014 by Professor Dennis Noble of Oxford University, together with about 100 other evolutionary scientists. In it they state that Darwinism doesn't work, just as Alfred Wallace said nearly 150 years earlier in 1866. Darwin's origins was the first way, and neo-Darwinism the second way, and now Noble and his group are looking for a third way to provide an evolutionary materialistic solution to the question of origins. The following deny the validity of Darwinian evolution and indeed any other form of random selection. Number 1. The symmetry and proportion of all creatures and plants and their environmental fitness. In other words, they are all fit for purpose, which, you may recall, was noted by Darwin. Number 2, the beauty and colouring of these creatures and plants. Number 3, the appearance of 2 genders of every species, which are essential for reproduction. Could they just evolve unaided at the same time? Number 4, a food chain suddenly appeared, with sufficient food for all species. Number 5, the interdependency amongst species. Number 6, the complexities of each creature and plant, which are a clear sign of design. Number 7, great minds were needed to investigate, research, experiment, and make complicated calculations to discover the laws in nature and how things work, all of which were in fact created by a much greater mind. No credit is ever given to the creator for what is discovered, because all the focus is on the discoverer. Number 8, the modern theory of abiogenesis is a rehash of the old theory of spontaneous generation, which believed that living creatures could arise from non-living matter and that such processes were commonplace and regular. Louis Pasteur discredited this theory by experiment and stated that life comes from life. Number 9, impersonal forces cannot produce anything personal. It takes a personal being to produce persons. Life comes from life, and nothing comes from nothing. Number 10, symbiosis. One creature relying on another for existence and a close relationship between 2 organisms of different kinds which benefits both organisms. What did these creatures and organisms do while waiting for the others to come along? Number 11, adaptive redundancy. The short life of a species, when critical systems are corrupted to produce an alleged evolving part, as per Darwin's imagined the small steps, which actually don't exist. Number 12, biomimetics. Nature has so perfectly been designed that there is a growth industry in copying these designs by means of man's intelligence. Number 13, evolutionists claim that simple life evolved from non-life using natural selection, chance and time. However, the so-called simple cell is anything but simple. A quote from newscientist.com. Simple bacterium shows surprisingly complexity. The inner workings of a supposedly simple bacterial cell have turned out to be much more sophisticated than expected. End of quote. The cell is in fact very complex, like a highly automated modern factory, and it could not just evolve unaided from non-living chemicals. Number 14. Bill Gates, quoted from The Road Ahead. Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. End of quote. The complex design programming within the living cell requires information which indicates intelligence. Number 15. There are 12 different parts to a cell, with a total count of 21 parts, all within a membrane. The cells then need a body plan to coordinate production of a body. Number 16. How could an undirected random process produce millions of male and female genders for reproduction by changing single-cell asexual prokaryotic organisms into sexual eukaryotic organisms, and also providing detailed body plans such that both sexes could mate and reproduce? This whole process requires foreknowledge and intelligence. Sir John Maddox, in his book What Remains to be Discovered, said, "The overriding question is when, and then how, sexual reproduction itself evolved. Despite decades of speculation, we do not know." Number 17. Recently, Dr. Anne Gorger has said that we have a circular argument. For the first living cell, you need DNA, RNA, and protein. You need DNA to make RNA to make protein, but you need protein to make DNA. We might ask the evolutionist, how do you get out of that circle? Number 18. The inferred equation, physics plus chemistry equals biology, is impossible. There was no laboratory. Because of these problems and limitations, many scientists now predict a significant shift away from macroevolution to an alternative theory, perhaps including a third way. As we have pointed out previously, the location of the Earth and its environment are, amazingly, just right for life. The scientific evidence for this has been confirmed by many scientists of past and present. We'll just mention a few, beginning with John Ray, FRS, who lived from 1627 to 1705. He was a leading botanist and naturalist. He published important works on botany, zoology, natural theology, and he classified plants in his Historia Planetarum according to similarities and differences that emerged from observation. He was among the first to attempt a biological definition for species, as a group of similar organisms arising from a common ancestor. He declared in his book, The Wisdom of God Manifested in His Works of Creation, that the vast number of plants, creatures, and stars demonstrated the unlimited extent of the Creator's skill, wisdom, and power. Next, we refer to William Paley, 1743 to 1805. He was a Christian apologist and philosopher, and author of Natural Theology, which was published in 1802, over half a century before Darwin published his book, Origins. Having read Paley's book, Darwin wrote, "The old argument from design in nature, as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered." But natural selection was not discovered by Darwin, as he later admitted. We note that creative law had already been declared as part of evolution long before Darwin's so-called new law. It has also been declared recently by Stephen Hawkins in his book The Grand Design, published in 2010. In his book, Hawkins said, "Because there is a law, such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going." End of quote. But let's read what Paley wrote in his book Natural Theology in 1802, which we note was over 200 years before the publication of Hawkins' book. In his book, Paley responded to the assertion of creation by creative law. And we might say there is nothing new under the sun. On page 6 of his book, Paley writes, "It is a perversion of language to assign any law as the efficient operative cause of anything. A law presupposes an agent, for it is only the mode according to which an agent proceeds. It implies a power, for it is the order according to which that power acts. Without this agent, without this power, which are both distinct from itself, the law does nothing and is nothing." Page 9. "There cannot be design without a designer." Page 21. "But could the want of the eye generate the gland which produces the tear, or bore the hole, the tear duct, by which it is discharged, a hole through a bone?" Page 129. "Consequently, a more certain proof of design and preparation, that is, the providing of things beforehand, which are not to be used until a considerable time afterwards. For this implies a contemplation of the future, which belongs only to intelligence." Page 141. "What was to become of the individual while the species was perfecting?" Page 197. "If the water had exceeded its present proportion, even by a trifling quantity, compared with the whole globe, all the land would have been covered. Had there been much less than there is, there would not have been enough to fertilize the continent." Page 211. "There may be many second causes, and many causes of second causes, one behind the other, between what we observe of nature and the deity. But there must be intelligence somewhere. There must be more in nature than what we see, and among the things unseen, there must be an intelligent, designing author." Page 212. "And after all, how or in what sense is it true that animals produce their like? A butterfly with a proboscis instead of a mouth, with 4 wings and 6 legs, produces a hairy caterpillar with jaws and teeth and 14 feet. A frog produces a tadpole. A black beetle with gauze wings and a crusty covering produces a white, smooth, soft worm. An ephemeral fly, a codbait maggot." Page 221. "Upon the whole, after all the schemes and struggles of a reluctant philosophy, the necessary resort is to a deity. The marks of design are too strong to be got over. Design must have had a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person is God." Page 222. "It is an immense conclusion that there is a God, a perceiving, intelligent, designing being at the head of creation, and from whose will it proceeded. The attributes of such a being, suppose his reality to be proved, must be adequate to the magnitude, extent, and multiplicity of his operations, which are not only vast beyond comparison with those performed by any other power, but so far as respects our conceptions of them, infinite, because they are unlimited on all sides." Page 224. "The only reflection, perhaps, which arises in our minds from this view of the world around us is, that the laws of nature everywhere prevail, that they are uniform and universal." But what do you mean by the laws of nature, or by any law? A law cannot execute itself. A law refers us to an agent. Effects are produced by power, not by laws. In the early 1600s, Johann Kepler discovered the laws of planetary motion and founded the modern study of optics. His Christian belief that God created the cosmos in an orderly manner inspired him to attempt to research and understand the laws that govern the natural world, especially in astronomy. He wrote, "Those laws of nature are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image, so that we could share in his own thoughts." His quote is often summarized as, "I am merely thinking God's thoughts after him." Sir Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727, was one of the greatest mathematicians and scientists who ever lived, and he formulated the law of universal gravity, etc. He wrote, "Gravity may put the planets into motion, but without the divine power it could never put them into such a circulating motion as they have about the sun, and therefore, for this as well as other reasons, I am compelled to ascribe the frame of this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets to an intelligent agent and powerful being." He went on to say, "Atheism is so senseless. When I look at the solar system, I see the Earth at the right distance from the sun to receive the proper amounts of heat and light. This did not happen by chance. God made and governs the world invisibly, and has commanded us to love and worship him, and no other God." James Clerk Maxwell, 1831 to 1879. He was a great mathematician and scientist, and discovered the connection between magnetism and electricity, and many other things. Albert Einstein acknowledged his debt to Maxwell, saying, "The work of Maxwell had changed the world forever." Einstein had a photograph of Maxwell on the wall of his office. Maxwell was described as the Einstein of Scotland. James was a Christian, and he wrote this prayer: "Almighty God, who has created man in thine own image, and made him a living soul, that he might seek after thee, and have dominion over thy creatures, teach us to study the works of thy hands, that we may subdue the earth for our use, and strengthen the reason for thy service, so to receive thy blessed word, that we may believe on him whom thou hast sent, to give us the knowledge of salvation and the remission of sins. All of which we ask in the name of the same Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen." Blaise Pascal, from 1623 to 1662. He was a great mathematician, who said, "In faith there is enough light for those who want to believe, and enough shadows to blind those who don't. The gospel to me is simply irresistible. Men despise religion, they hate it, and are afraid it may be true." John Ray, FRS, from 1627 to 1705, was a naturalist and botanist who said, "There is for a free man no occupation more worthy and delightful than to contemplate the bounteous works of nature and honour the infinite wisdom and goodness of God. And let it not suffice to be book-learned, to read what others have written, and to take upon trust more falsehood than truth. But let us ourselves examine things as we have opportunity, and converse with nature as well as with books." And returning to William Paley, he said, "Living organisms are even more complicated than watches in a degree which exceeds all computation. How else to account for the often amazing adaptations of animals and plants? Only an intelligent designer could have created them, just as only an intelligent watchmaker can make a watch. The marks of design are too strong to be got over. Design must have had a designer. That designer must have been a person. That person is God. And if God had taken such care in designing even the most humble and insignificant organisms, how much more must God care for humanity?" We mention now Van Leeuwenhoek, a self-taught researcher, in 1676. His extensive research into the growth of very small creatures like fleas helped to disprove the theory of spontaneous generation of life. This erroneous theory is now promoted as biogenesis, which is equally false. As a Christian, he often referred with reverence to the wonders of God's design in making creatures great and small, and believed that his discoveries were merely further proof of the wonder of creation. These views and statements of study and faith have been shared by many scientists down the ages, including Robert Boyle, Michael Faraday, Lord Kelvin, Charles Babbage, and many more. To learn about what today's Christians, who are scientists, say about the creation, then you can look online on the YouTube channels of Professor John Lennox, Stuart Burgess, James Tour, Stephen Meyer, etc. And we have to say, it takes more faith to believe in random, impersonal chance than in a personal designer, creator, and redeemer. And a final quote, this time from C.S. Lewis, an Oxford Don. Supposing there was no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It is merely that when the atoms inside my skull happen, for physical or chemical reasons, to arrange themselves in a certain way, this gives me, as a byproduct, the sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist, or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God.